I have a saying that I say to founders, and I really believe it, which is that founders should get dragged kicking and screaming into starting a company because they have to, because it needs to exist. That they won't be able to sleep because they'll keep thinking about how it needs to exist and they must do it.
Welcome to Brick by Brick, where we learn how companies were really built directly from the people who built them. My guest today is my friend Jared Fliesler. Jared has had a pretty incredible career. He started out doing business development for a traditional investment company focused on tax-advantaged real estate investments. Frustrated with the bureaucracy, he took his first startup role at Slyde, the photo sharing company Max Levchin started in the early days of social media. Over his time at Slyde, Jared went from junior BD person to executive team member and ran their core product. When Slyde sold to Google in 2010, Jared became a director there, while starting to advise the then nascent Square. After a year at Google, he joined Square full-time as general manager and eventually led the growth and business operations teams, 5xing the payment volume during his tenure. Now, I first met Jared post his time at Square, when he joined me and the rest of the team at Matrix Partners in 2013. Jared was one of the youngest GPs in the industry at 29 years old when he joined Matrix. You'll notice a trend of Jared bucking the norm and being pretty young for the roles he's taken on. Jared couldn't kick the startup bug though, so he went back to operating and joined Scribd as a COO after Matrix. He's not a huge fan of being thought of as an ops guy and still ran product, marketing, design, and other non-traditional areas for a CEO while at Scribd. Over his 4 years at Scribd, he supported the company through fundraising, scaling down and then up headcount, more than doubling revenue, and weathering the COVID storms, eventually leaving a few years ago and taking an unexpected turn to launch a new type of coaching for founders. I can't wait to dive in. Jared, welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So, we've known each other a long time. We're going to just jump right in. It feels like you took a huge leap going from marketing and studying marketing to working in real estate and then doing BD and payments for a startup. How did that happen? What gave you the conviction to make the jump from traditional finance to a small startup? And really, what the heck is Yelp Elite?
Sure. It does seem a little strange. I'm not sure that anybody in startups and working as an entrepreneur has a direct line. I've actually gotten asked quite a few times when people are wanting to go into venture, like, well, what should I do? Or wanting to go into startups, like, what path should I take for kids going into college? And the answer is like, I don't really know, there's not one thing that everybody did. And for me, it was the same. I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri. In St. Louis, a startup, at least at that time, was a coffee shop or a restaurant. This is what it meant to be at a startup. I always loved technology. When I grew up, I was actually building websites. I had webproduction.net was my earliest startup when I was 15 years old, I think. And I was using Dreamweaver and building websites. And I just loved technology as a kid, putting together computers, taking them apart, and learning all about it. But the idea of working in a startup, like working inside the internet, didn't really make sense to me. When I graduated, not a single person that I knew went to go work for a startup. And so I just did what I needed to do. I was in San Francisco. I needed to pay rent. I took the highest paying job I could find. I had really no idea how to connect what I had learned to what I would do as a career. And I was in that. But luckily, one thing stayed true throughout my entire life, which is my love of eating. And so I've loved restaurants, and Yelp popped up when I was in college as this restaurant review site. So I went on and I was reading these restaurant reviews, and I was writing a bunch of my own reviews. I was like, oh, I get to be Michael Bauer, and write these restaurant reviews. And through that, there were probably only about 100 or so of us that were writing most of the content. Typical rules around, user-generated content sites. A really small portion of the users are writing most of the reviews, and then a bunch of people are consuming it. And we were all known as our first name, last initial. So I was Jared F. And it turns out that Keith Raboy, he saw my reviews. And I went to these Yelp Elite parties. Yelp Elite was a way to recognize these like core folks that were writing most of the content. And so I'd get invited to these Yelp Elite parties where we would do menu tastings, and there would be holiday parties. And the Yelp team was there too. It was kind of like their version of a holiday party, but inviting their top users. And so I got to meet that team, meet Keith, meet Max Levchin. And that was really my introduction into startups. It came back full circle years later when I met Chamath for the first time. He's like, wait, you're Jared F. My assistant has your page bookmarked. I tell her to go there in order to find out restaurants in San Francisco. So I didn't even realize how many people had seen these reviews, but it ended up being my introduction into startups. And so fast forward, I'm my first year into work. I'm at this company that's all about tenure. It's not a meritocracy. It's kind of like your traditional finance and investment firm. And I'm talking to Keith about this and saying like, I don't understand. He said, well, why don't you talk to this company Slide that he was about to join? And I remember I went over to Slide's office after work, and my office was empty. At 5:01 p.m., everyone was out the door. And so it's probably 6 o'clock. I get over to Slide, and I'm like, that's weird. There's all this noise. So I got through this elevator, and there's a double door that's locked, and I buzz it, and they let me in. No receptionist, just like chairs that are sitting there. This is old school, early 2000s. And I walk in, and all the desks are full. There's people everywhere. I was like, I don't understand what's going on. There's dogs running through the aisles. I see babies walking around. Like there's families that are there. Pizza's getting delivered. I was like, what is happening? They're like, oh, this is just how we work, right?
This is a Tuesday. Yeah.
It was wild, and I loved it. And so I joined 11 days later.
Amazing. Amazing. And look, you've gone on to such an amazing career to date on all of the things you've done. And, one of the through lines that I've seen and in conversations with Keith and others who you've worked with, and I experienced myself, one of your strengths is the ability you have and your willingness to go deep on very complex topics, develop an understanding, and help translate what you learn in plain English to others. For example, the IRS tax code. Your clarity of thought and your ability to communicate is one of your superpowers. How has that helped you through your career in technology?
Yeah. So I think the reality is that I've gotten asked this before of like, what do you think your superpower is? And sometimes I say storytelling. And I think the reality is that you have to tell stories to everyone. You have to tell stories to your customers, stories that help them understand what your product is and why they should use it. You have to tell stories to early employees. Why should they join you? Why should they follow you on this mission? You have to tell stories to your company as it grows. Why does this continue to be an amazing company and this incredible opportunity? Someone you have to tell stories to board members, to Wall Street, right, to the public. Like you really have to figure out this narrative development of what is it that you're imagining. Founders do this all the time. They go into the unknown. They often go into places where many people have failed before, and they have to convince people. I've heard this called the reality distortion field. They have to convince people that their alternative way of thinking actually makes sense. And so you have to get really good at this narrative development and storytelling. I think Jack Dorsey is one of the best storytellers in the world. He has an amazing video on the Golden Gate Bridge, and he would use this all the time to tell the story of how we were going to build a payments product. That the Golden Gate Bridge isn't just a bridge. It's this beautiful landmark. It's this incredible thing that people go to see. There's not that many bridges in the world that people go to take photographs of, right? So the way that the bridge was approached was through an elegant design, through this beautiful thought process of really thinking through the details at a level that no one ever had. And we did the same thing with how we build product. And so I think when you take this into your role, no matter how senior you get, some of the stuff is going to be fun and enjoyable. And then you're going to have what I call the chores, the boring pieces, whether that is compliance, audits, taxes, editing, rehearsing, administrative work. But that stuff's really important. And so at every role, at Slide, it was advertising and Facebook compliance and PCI compliance. At Google, we had a whole new set of processes, the famous, performance evaluation process of perf, budgeting, but all of these things are important. And so let's take like performance reviews as an example. You can phone it in, and a lot of people do, right? Or you can take the time to really collect helpful feedback for your team. And you can take the time to figure out how to communicate that in a way that they're going to be able to hear it. Now, I haven't met anyone that likes doing it. I certainly don't. But it may be the single most motivating thing that you can do for an employee. It might even dwarf the meaning and impact that you would have with just giving them a small raise and skipping over it. And so when we think about these things that are boring or mundane or chores, sometimes it's worth thinking about what is that downstream impact. So I think about this saying that my partner uses, which is make magic of the mundane. And it's in these unexpected, often boring little moments where we can surprise and delight. It's like walking into the kitchen at the office and seeing that someone brought in fresh baked cookies. Like, I think it's just that moment that you're not expecting. And so if you can think about what impact is that going to have versus the act itself, I think there's a way to find a lot of joy and fulfillment in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And maybe on that point, just for a second, when you think about storytelling and being intentional about the stories that you tell, how have you seen people really be focused and intentional, even if you may feel like you're a good storyteller? Obviously it's something you have to continue to work on. Anything that you do to improve your storytelling ability?
I think the biggest one is you got to test it out. You have to see what resonates, right? So the people that are these great storytellers and have these amazing, tweetable moments, they've probably told that story 1,000 times, right? They've gotten really used to it. And I just remember, so there's this question about how do you turn a moment into a teachable moment? I remember the CEO of Intuit talking about this at a talk that I went to maybe 10 years ago. There was this sort of like unconference in California. And he talked about how there are different types of moments. And he said that some moments are crystal moments and some moments are rubber moments. And that some moments, when you drop them, they shatter and they'll never exist again. And other moments bounce and you'll have another opportunity. So it's like, look, my daughter is going to have a lot of piano recitals, but she's only going to have one graduation. And so, really amazing storytellers, they take the story and they think about what can I say? And that idea of like crystal shattering makes that memorable versus him just saying, hey, my daughter has a lot of these rehearsals, a lot of recitals, but she only has one graduation. It's like, how do you turn that moment into something that you can remember, that you're going to pass along, that sticks with you? So incredible storytellers, they make it visual. They get really good about this, just like incredible writers. And so I think there's something about being a leader, about rehearsing that story, making sure that it resonates, coming up with metaphors. And I think about this all the time. I had somebody say, I need a Jared framework for that. And I found that like I just do this often. And I think some of it comes from this thing around storytelling. So I think rehearsing that, testing with different audiences, making sure that it's clear and that people understand it are all things you can do to get better at it.
No, makes sense. Now, storytelling obviously plays a major role in business development, in sales, in convincing customers to work with you. You've done incredibly hard things, negotiate with record labels, convince mom and pop shops to switch payment processors. Which has been harder and why?
They're all hard for different reasons. With mom and pop shops, we were going door to door in some cases, trying to connect with our end consumer at Square and trying to get them to use us versus the traditional box reader. But at least there, the person you're talking to is your customer and you're seeking to understand what it is that they want. What would make them want to switch? What fear do they have? And how can you overcome it? And then you go back to the company, back to your office, and you're like, okay, we got to work on these problems. We have to fix them, right? And so you're actually starting to solve those customer needs. Whereas in other cases, like when we worked with the record labels, it was so much more frustrating because you're dealing with all this bureaucracy, all of these levels that you have to go through. We spent 2 years just getting to a white paper deal before we could even sign it. And so just this idea that you don't have the person in the room who's going to make the decision, you have these layers of people and everything is changing around them and there's all these incentives. So I think that sometimes these more complex BD deals are tough because you can't just get in a room and hammer it out and make it happen. And it's so refreshing when you're building a direct to consumer product and you can talk to those customers and try to fix it. But it's not always what you hear, And so we found we did one of the most interesting things that we did at Square was this study where we couldn't understand. We were going out to customers and trying to figure out why they weren't going with us. And at some point, when we asked them, we would go out and we said, well, what do you want? They said, oh, we need lower fees and we need no contracts and we need no fine print. And so what did we do? We changed our policies. Like we never actually had those things, but we made sure, let's be clear about this. So on our homepage, we said, no hidden fees, low price, 2.75%, no fixed costs per transaction, no contracts, right? So we literally moved this up to our top line messaging and made sure that for each of their things, even when we needed to change what we were doing, that we did it so that it spoke to what their needs and desires were. And so at some point we did a blind study where we didn't say that we were a Square, we just called these mom and pop shops and we said, hey, we're calling to figure out who you work with on credit card processing and what's important to you. And we'd go through with them. And it was funny. What we would hear is, well, yes, if only. So the findings of the study were, if only there was a company that didn't have a contract, didn't have any hidden fees, and charged 2.75% or less, not only would we switch to them, we would pay the fee to cancel with our current provider and switch them. And then we would say, well, have you heard of Square? And they might or they might not. We would say like, oh, I don't know. I'm looking at the website. We've recently heard of them. Here they are. If you look at the website, it says, 2.75%, no hidden fees, no fixed fee per transaction. Have you thought about switching to them? And they would say, you can't trust those guys. The credit card processors aren't to be trusted. They have these teaser rates. And so we realized that the thing we were fighting against was trust. It was no matter what we did, no matter what we said, they weren't going to believe us because it was us saying it. And that's what led us to do testimonial based marketing, where we would interview merchants and they would talk about their experience with us. And that skyrocketed our conversion rates and massively improved marketing. It allowed us to go into television. It just unlocked the door incredibly in terms of what we could do and new channels we can go into. And so you have to do a lot of creative digging in this to understand what you're up against and how to overcome it.
No, that's a great story, and I mean, you guys were the best in the business in that storytelling and convincing merchants who I have a deep understanding of and experience with at point to switch to new technology. It was incredible. And so, on that in that same vein, startups are all about doing things that don't scale in the hunt for product market fit. Do you have a favorite story about an early hacky thing that you guys did, whether it's Slide, Square, or even Scribd?
Yeah, probably my favorite version of this. So we had an idea that there was some tipping point at Square where if enough merchants around you were using us, that you would want to use us as well. That there would be sort of this mix of not really peer pressure as much as just kind of like table stakes. If you're on Main Street and there are 8 other businesses around you and they're all accepting credit card, you probably need to accept credit card as well. The customers on Main Street are going to start to just bring their card and not bring cash, and you're going to miss out. They're going to go to your competition. So we realized that at some point, or we thought, what is this tipping point? How many people around you, how often do you need to see Square? How many merchants around you need to be using it for you to start to feel the value of accepting credit card payments? Because for a lot of small merchants, they look at it and they're like, yeah, but there's costs associated. I'd rather use cash. But it turns out people spend generally 20 to 30% less when they use cash. There's loss prevention that you have to worry about. You have to make change. You've got to drop off the money every night. You've got to count down your drawers. So there's all these other things that come up with it that people just don't think about. And so we said, how can we test this idea of tipping point? We can't do what we would call like a surround sound takeover just across the entire United States. That would cost us hundreds of millions of dollars. What if we went to a small town that kind of looks like other markets and we took it over? And so that's what we did. We went to Charlotte and we did a bunch of out of home. So we bought billboards and like bus stops and all of this marketing in magazines, just things we would never do at a national level. So we bought all this marketing in Charlotte. And then we sponsored the local hockey game. And we went and we did ground team. We had a bunch of our employees and volunteers come and we handed out squares and we onboarded merchants and we gave out t-shirts and I was there like standing and giving out bags at the hockey game, letting people know what Square was. And it's something we could never do at a national level, or maybe the company could do it now. But at the time, we wanted to see what would happen in that market when we applied this treatment of surround sound. Totally unscalable, very difficult to do. But if it worked, we had this idea that we could kind of drop in these surround sound campaigns to strategic areas and that they would start to spiral out. That those communities, people would come into Charlotte and then go back and they would have Square. And then more people would come in and that you would see this kind of expansion around the Charlotte area. And if we could monitor that, we could calculate what the benefit was versus the cost and invest in marketing in a way that wouldn't make sense from the outside, but given our K factor and the pass along rate of the product could potentially make sense.
No, that's awesome. I mean, it reminds me of the Uber city launchers a little bit and how here's the playbook. Let's go out and conquer and figure out the nuances of any individual city. and go forth and conquer there. Oh, that's terrific. On that same front, then, were there any unexpected butterfly effect moments that initially seemed inconsequential but had unexpected cultural business impact? Like the street team in Charlotte. Oh, now that's just going to be how we launched new cities around the world, or anything of that sort.
Yeah, there's two things that I think about when you ask this. One is this moment where the entire leadership team got together. This was, I'm still on Square, I guess, as I just think about these examples. And there were flecks of metal that had gone into the plastic molding. One of the tools, for some reason, as it was drilling holes into the Square reader device in the early days, little shavings of metal were coming off and they were getting spread out into the white plastic. And so what you ended up with were speckled Square card readers. And there was zero impact on whether or not the card reader would work. But visually, it looked like something was off about them. And it was inconsistent. Some had many defects, many little flecks of metal, some had very few. And Jack made the decision that we should not send out any readers with defects. Now, the reason why this was critical is because we were transitioning from an old reader into a new reader, and our inventory levels, we had stopped making the old one. So our inventory levels were very low, and we risked potentially not having readers to send out to new users that wanted them. So we'd be paying for marketing and then not being able to send a reader out to a customer. But he felt so strongly that the Square brand, this visual element, was so strong and needed to be without imperfections, or that might say things about how we approach that customer's payments. And so I still don't know to this day, did that really matter? What would the impact have been if we had sent out these speckled readers? I thought maybe we should have like a disco edition where we have it speckled intentionally, but it wouldn't have been consistent. Um, but what I love about that story as I think back about it, and I learned a lot from Jack in this moment, was that sort of attention to detail, that overthinking it, as some people might think, or being too hard on the design side, led to a lot of what we did that created the magic in the product. And so I still don't know to this day, but the repercussions of that mentality certainly is a huge part of what's led to Square's success. We weren't the first credit card reader. We weren't the first one in market at all. But we did have something that no one else had in the way that we approached the design. The other thing sort of connected to this was this idea of signing with your finger. And so previously, when people would engage in credit card transactions, they didn't actually engage with the UI of the product, right? As the customer, the merchant would engage, but we had this idea of signing with your finger. So we would actually show the iPad or the phone to the customer and they would sign. And the number of customers like, oh, that's cool. What is this? It was the first sort of digital receipt. Oh, I'm going to type in my email. I'm going to type in my phone number. This idea of getting both the merchant and the customer to engage with the product had a huge impact on us. 10% of people in the United States are connected to or own a small business. And so those SMBs, those people, when they're not running their dentist office or their art gallery or their accounting firm, they're getting coffee, they're going to the store, they're going to the market. And so getting those people to see and experience our product for free through our merchants was a huge part of what made us successful.
No, absolutely. On that point about Jack, as an operator, you worked for and alongside three very different CEOs in Max Levchin, Jack Dorsey, and then Trip Adler at Scribd. And of course, with hundreds more as a coach and investor. How did you and do you adapt or adjust your style of work to the founder or CEO that you're partnering with?
So I think this question is actually important in all directions. Certainly, you have the CEO as a figure, and most people think about this as like it's the CEO running the company, and so it's their way or the highway. I've kind of got to get in line. I think as a founder and as a CEO, you have to decide between outcomes and dogmatism. So you can be really dogmatic. This is my way. There's certainly plenty of famous characters who are well known for having their way and their approach. And it's a high stakes way to be. You better be right. and it comes at a cost, right? There's some people that don't want to work in that environment. There's some people that do. But this also is what has led to a fair amount of innovation, right? If Steve Jobs didn't have his approach, if he didn't push back, if he just flexed into the way everybody else wanted to be, we probably wouldn't have the iPhone, right? And if Elon was this way, we probably wouldn't have Tesla. And we certainly wouldn't have rockets. So I think that it is important to have this balance between when are you doing something because of principles that you're dogmatic about that you shouldn't be, and when are you doing something because it's literally the thing that is going to make or break your business. And so I think that oftentimes you can choose to be a chameleon, but that takes a lot of energy. And it doesn't mean that you should actually be willing to just bend on everything. That's not what this is about. This is about knowing when to stand your ground and knowing when to push back. And so I found for much of my career that I needed to think about, okay, if I do X, what impact is that going to have? And do I care more about doing X in this way or getting a different outcome? And I've had this come up in so many ways. And so I had to think about that. You're right. Max, Jack, and Trip are totally different people. And I had to show up completely different with them and think about, okay, how does showing up in this way result in the things that I want it to result in and get me the information that I need to do my job and to be successful? And I think you really have to do that with your teams, with your leaders, with the folks that are in their team, at your all hands, with your board. And so it really comes into you're putting something in and you're getting something out. How do you think about those two relationships? How do you run experiments with them and be willing to flex on both sides with the outcome really being the thing that you're working towards?
Yeah. And look, companies also go through phases of growth. In my experience, working for a startup means almost working for a new company every year. New colleagues around the table, new products to build, new walls to run through. Having seen all the phases of a company's evolution, how would you break down those stages of growth, and which stage did you find to be the most fun?
So I think early on, you are working in a petri dish. You're just trying to get something to work. And it's way before you think about how are we going to make money or how are we going to get more users. It's just, I believe in this thing. Generally, it's a thing or a problem that exists in the world, and I believe it could be better. Here's my approach, and here's the delta in the status quo between how people are solving for that today. So first, you're starting to work in a petri dish. Then after you get something, that's working there, you go, okay, well, now I need to throw some users at it. So then you've got to go and figure out how you're going to get users. Then once you have some small number of users, I think there's this new stage, which is really in scaling. So that's figuring out how can I do this with organic loops in the product or paid channels or both? Like, how am I going to go out and get more users? Basically, you're like, okay, the first version of this product, if I did no more development on this product today, it's worth putting users against this. We're solving some problem. And there's this second piece, which is optimization of those channels. So first you go out and you say, okay, first I need to figure out even what are these channels? Some of them are organic, some of them are in the product, some of them are paid. And then you go into how do I optimize those? Now I'm spending all this money, but for some reason users are dropping out of the funnel and you start doing that optimization. And then the last one is really market expansion. So maybe you've done the petri dish, it's working out, you've gotten the initial users, now you're building these loops and these paid channels, and they're actually working and users are coming out of them. And then you optimize those channels. And at some point, you start to see that there isn't really more there. Maybe you've gotten all the users you can out of those channels, or maybe it's consistent, but it's like a layer cake. It's only bringing in this much. And you either recognize that with those users, you could be doing more. So you could do expansion within those accounts or with those individual users, depending if you're doing enterprise or consumer. Or you say, look, we're serving this market pretty well, but we're doing all the things we can or most of the things we can to get these customers. What if we also served this additional market and layered it on top? And so you end up in this market expansion mode. I think these things are all fun in their own ways. The earliest days of a petri dish is really that initial product market fit. The place that I've probably spent the most time I get most excited about is kind of that step 3 and 4. This is like, okay, you've got something that's initially working, you have some users against it, and now you're trying to scale. How do you tweak the product so that it grows itself through organic loops? How do you start to test into paid channels? And then my favorite part is, great, we've got something, like how do we pour fuel on it? How do we scale this up? How do we grow our team? How do we level up our leadership? How do we think about this in a broader way? How do we get these channels working for us? How do we come up with new ideas that are going to make the funnel work much better. That's the stuff that I've spent most of my career on, that I get so excited about. And that's also sort of where I tend to help founders and work with them, is when they're in this kind of like post Series A. They've got something that's working and they're trying to scale it, and figure out how you do that, where to pour the gas.
Yep. In that early phase, so much of the company build is firefighting, focusing on the immediate problems, what's right in front of you. And it takes some effort to really be able to step back and think, around two corners. Is there a particular role, process, function, some infrastructure you think early stage companies should invest in more often and earlier in a company's life than they do today?
Yeah, so it probably sounds overly simple, but I say get good at hiring. Read the Who book, understand all of your terrible practices about interviewing people with hypotheticals and how that doesn't at all statistically map to their outcomes. Be clear on what you're trying to hire for versus getting emotionally swept up in a person. Be as objective and outcome oriented as you can be, just like you are in the rest of the business. And then, as I contradict myself, be willing to break all the rules, but only do it about once a year, and mostly do it when you think that a person that you're talking to could be the CEO of something at your company. And the reason why I say this is, if all you do is hire people when you have a deep need, you've defined it as a job description, you've gone out, you started recruiting people, you're never going to be opportunistic around that person who comes along once in a lifetime and is this incredible person to lead an area of your company. But I think the trap is, if you get in this mode of, oh, we just hire smart people whenever they show up, unless you're really, really, really good at finding things for those people to do, or they happen to be really, really good at finding things for them to do themselves, then you burn out. And you really need people to do the roles that are required at the company. Those people can also be incredibly distracting. Maybe they find tons of things to do, new businesses to build, new ways to suck up resources, new ways to take up your team's time, and gets them away from the core product. So it's this balance, but the number one thing is, you've got to build an amazing team. Like, that's what's going to enable you to scale. You need to dismiss people from your team quickly and be really clear about it. Otherwise, your great people on your team get pissed off that they're having to carry the dead weight. And why have you not done your job as a CEO to get rid of these people that are not doing theirs? So the easiest way to manage this is actually never to have those people come in your company to begin with, by getting really good at hiring. And I just see that time and time again across companies.
Yeah, I mean, look, you've hired hundreds of people throughout your career, and you've said before that the one mistake companies make is hiring as fast as possible, which feels good. What about firing? How fast is too fast when it comes to dismissing people?
So I think the thing with firing is how you do it. It's a necessary evil. It's something that you have to do. You're not going to get it 100% right across your team. You're going to hire people that are not working out. And I think the key thing is to be respectful with hiring. You've got to move hiring from feeling like it's this emotional, subjective thing to an objective thing. Hey, I had these expectations. We talked about them. I gave you feedback. You're not delivering. It doesn't look like it's working out. It's really hard to argue with that and to say, I can't believe, Rishi, that you're accusing me of this. No, I'm not accusing you of anything. Here's what we set as goals 3 months ago. Here's what you delivered. It's not working out. This is what the company needs. I wish that it would have, and truly feeling that way and being authentic about it. And so, lots of people have read Trillion Dollar Coach and have heard about Bill Campbell. I think he's one of the greatest coaches and CEOs of all time. And one thing that I really love that he talks about in his book is about treating people with as much respect on the way out as you do on the way in. And I really, really agree with that. I think you have to think about the second order cultural impacts versus just this person in their role, right? What happens when you let go of this person who is a cultural ambassador in the company? How does that impact people around them? Do people understand why this person is getting dismissed? Do people think that the person quit? Do people think that it was you, that it was your company, or do they realize that it was their performance, right? And how close are you to the company being destabilized as you fire folks? So there is some thought that needs to go into just pulling all the pins out. And I've seen founders sometimes get overzealous on this and be like, I've got to cut deep and it's fine. I can do this person's role. but they don't pause to think about, hey, but I have a full-time role and I can't do six of these people's role at the same time. And so you have to be strategic in what the timing of this is, balance with the fact that you don't want to keep people around longer than they should be there, and trying to make it as objective as possible so that it has the minimal emotional impact in the company because it's really thoughtful and it's done with respect.
Yeah. And cultural dynamics and figuring out the right people for the organization and how they are adding to the culture or detracting from the culture is critical. And of course, building that early stage culture is so important. On that point, tell me about Scribd historians. What is it and why was it important at Scribd?
Yeah, so I have not thought about that term in a long time. So you're taking me back. This concept, so historians were a name that we gave folks at Scribd that were early folks that effectively were cultural anchors. They were they knew two things. So one, they had historical knowledge of how Scribd was, how we wanted to be as a company in terms of our values, what we were trying to do, trade-offs that we had made. And so they knew things like, hey, we've already tested that brand new idea that you have new PM who's joining us today. Like, let's not run through a bunch of exercises to do that. Like, we've done that 3 other times. Let's not waste the time. But they also understood how our systems work. So every company has tech debt. They're building layers on top of layers on top of layers. When I joined Scribd, it was a 10-year-old company. And so this was so critical to have people that knew, well, what did we do 7 years ago? What did we learn from that experience? And I've seen this at every company. I joined Slide when we were about 50 people. I joined Square when we were 30 as an advisor, full-time around 100, and Scribd when we were 100. And so each of these companies grew significantly, and it's really hard to hold on to that culture and to remember what happened, what wasn't documented. And it's really important, right? It keeps you connected to the core of why you started the company and why you want to build it into what you hope it will become, and that core mission and value.
You've been coaching, investing in, and advising founders for much of your career. Are there universal challenges that you find founders face along their journeys?
Yeah, I mean, I see some recurring themes, but the reality is everybody's on their own journey. If you're doing something big that hasn't been done before successfully, you're going against the odds. And any founder that isn't at least partially fearful that they're going to fail probably isn't being honest with themselves or the people around them. If you ask most people what the opposite of vulnerability is, they'll say words like strength, conviction, confidence. And we learn that being vulnerable is synonymous with being weak and that it's dangerous as leaders to be vulnerable. Luckily, Brene Brown and others have now popularized this and we're having conversations about it. But as we think about it, like when I was growing up in startups in the early 2000s, and it shifted a bit, but I think it's actually shifting back, we really learned to avoid emotions altogether, that it was better and safer for them to just not be in the workplace. And there are some benefits to that for sure, especially as we move into lots of controversial opinions making their way into the workplace. It becomes this hotbed for conversations and discourse that really have nothing to do with the work that you're doing. But the challenge with that is the reality is that nearly every massively valuable company that has ever been built was built on the top of a foundation of relationships. These aren't just coworkers that are clocking in and out. When you look at the early days of Apple, it was about friends getting together and building a company, right? Like workers clock in and out, come in at 9 and leave at 5, and they punch the card and they don't care what happens outside of that, right? So that's not generally how these companies have been built. You have to figure out how to build these tight-knit relationships and have strength and vision as a CEO and lean into your emotions to connect authentically with your team. This is how we build relationships. It's how we build friendships. It's how we build movements and get people to actually want and care and need to be a part of something. Like when I think about the early days of any company I was in, whether it's Slide with that story of showing up at 6, 7 o'clock and there being pizza and beer and people bringing their families in, or it's Square where we would have smoothies delivered at 10 p.m. and we'd have people working on weekends and going to Charlotte and spending all week, nights and days and weekends and early mornings, or it's at Scribd where we had to have people that were there for a decade of their life as historians, right? This is about having these deep emotional connections and bringing them into the workplace to solidify those bonds and to do more than just have a job. So, having emotions, connecting through them, and talking about them is different than being controlled by them. And when you hear people saying like they do the work to scale as leaders, that's what they're doing. That's a lot of this. It's learning to be able to be vulnerable and connect through those emotions. But that doesn't mean that you're weak, and it doesn't mean that that's dictating your behaviors. And so I think this is something that something I see come up time and again with founders is this balance between, I'm early on with my first 5, 6 employees. These were my buddies. These were people that were roommates. We were in the office together all the time. I'm scaling my company. How do I maintain that connection and that culture and all the benefits that come from that? But I'm trying to grow up as a leader, and I'm trying to become stoic, and I'm trying to become like an adult in the room. How do I do that? And how do I balance? And I see a lot of people overcorrect. And so the reality is like, you still want to connect through those emotions, but you want to figure out how to get to a more neutral place to have more composure and command of them.
And so, dovetailing off of that, what is one thing all founders could stand to do more of?
I think one thing that people get into the mode of is that it's more efficient just to give people tasks, just to say, let's do this. And you can do that, and you can lead through that position power, but it doesn't help your team understand the why or to go on the journey with you. And the challenge with that is as you scale, you're just not around to tell people what to do. And so at some point, they're going to start asking, well, why are we doing those things? Or they're going to have to make decisions, and they haven't been taught by you why you think the way you do and what's really important underneath the decision. And so I think communicating the why and taking your team on the journey, it's a lot harder to teach somebody how to fish versus just grabbing a fish for them and handing it to them. But to do that as a founder means that you're enculturing the behaviors and the decision making around why you do the things you do. And I think it's a critical thing that most people could do a better job of.
Yep. Everything is storytelling. And so now you've been an early employee a number of times. What advice do you give to someone considering an early employee role at a startup, particularly perhaps people who have never worked at a startup before?
So this has shifted a little bit over time, but I think it's mostly still true. I think that there's a romanticization of working at a startup. Oh, you join a startup, it's really wild. There's no bureaucracy. You can do whatever you want to do. You have all this power, and you're going to make tons of money off your equity because all startups are really successful, right? There's this story that people kind of tell themselves. And sure, it is fun. You're closer to it, but it's kind of like going to a small town and being on a sports team. It's like, yeah, you get to be the lead player, but turns out you don't have any practice gear and you're borrowing a field from someone else, right? Like you're really much scrappier when you're at a startup. It's not that it's better, it's that it's different. And you have to make sure that it's the right kind of different for you. So are you prepared for those trade-offs? Are you ready to make it a part of your life versus just a job? And expect to get poorer, not richer. Expect to have less vacation, not more. Expect that in some ways you're going to have less flexibility because the expectations of that startup, and it's this risk reward trade off, are that it's becoming a part of your life, not that it's becoming your job. And so if you feel like you can connect to that, and if you're ready for that and you're excited by that, by all means, I think working at a startup is the most rewarding thing a person can do. I advise it to basically everyone that hasn't done it. It is certainly has been my favorite thing in my career was to work at startups, and it gave me a completely different perspective on work. But I don't think it's for everyone, and I think you have to be really clear about what the trade-offs are when you do it.
Well, you mentioned, working at a startup has been romanticized recently. Over the last decade, the title of co-founder or CEO has become coveted, a step along the ideal career path for your typical type A overachiever. But for most people, it absolutely does not make sense to start a company. Now, for you, slightly different. You have the skills, you have the network, you have the experience. Why did you never start your own company?
Tough question. I have thought about it probably a dozen times. And I even helped an ex start a company, raise initial capital, figure it out. Then COVID hit, and we had to shut down that business. Uh, I have a saying that I say to founders, and I really believe it, which is that founders should get dragged kicking and screaming into starting a company because they have to, because it needs to exist. That they won't be able to sleep because they'll keep thinking about how it needs to exist and they must do it. So I haven't felt that about a company, is sort of the easy answer. When I was at Square, I thought exactly as you've said. Starting a company and being both the CEO and the founder was something that I needed to do. It felt like the next logical step. It was what I was going to do on the pyramid, and I realized as I sat with it that so much of that was really ego. It was not knowing what I wanted to do. It was wanting to keep progressing and going to the top of the pyramid and romanticizing it and the glamour of being a founder and proving to myself that I could do it. And so as I was leaving Square, I was talking to VCs. I probably spent 6 months or so talking to different VCs. And I still remember one pointed out to me one day. He's like, hey, so just curious, like, what company do you want to start? And I said, oh, I don't know. I just want to start a company. And he's like, huh, it sounds like you want to start something, but you don't really know what. And that's ultimately what led me to going into venture and trying out. Was I didn't know what I wanted to start, and I wanted to just be in the mix of it. But, as I thought about it again, so now 5 years later, I left Scribd a few years ago, and I thought about it. And I found an even deeper interest in coaching than I did in a specific idea that I wanted to bring to life. So now, after 15 years of working at other people's companies, I've started my own, and now I get to coach founders. I spoke to dozens of coaches before I decided to start this solo, and thought about, should I join them? Should I join their firms? Again, like that same pattern matching. And the experience really took me back to my original litmus test. It really feels like this needs to exist in the way that I want to do it. And I really feel like I can maximize my impact by doing it as a new business versus joining someone else. So I finally became a founder, just not in the way that I thought I would.
Amazing. You just launched First Call. Tell us all about it. Who should be reaching out to you to get your help as a coach?
Sure. So 10 years ago, I hadn't even heard about coaching in the workplace, and certainly not in startups. I watched this show. Have you ever seen Billions?
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah. Okay. So I saw the first probably couple seasons of Billions. That was probably 7, 8 years ago. And there's this amazing character, Wendy Rhodes.
Wendy Rhodes, the best.
She's incredible. She's a psychologist that the hedge fund manager brings in to coach his team. Now, you've seen it, so you know Wendy. But for those that don't, Wendy is not what you think about as this typical kind of like warm HR person or therapist. She calls it as it is. She pushes the team. She doesn't hold back. And she is coaching for performance. She's not coaching to make people feel good. And I think when you think about most coaches, or you think about therapy, it's like, oh, how do I feel better? How do I deal with my emotions? That's very, very different. So a couple of years later, after seeing Billions and having this in the back of my head, I joined Scribd. And Trip had a coach, and I was like, oh, a coach, what's that? And during that time, coaching had become really popular. I knew a bunch of founders that had coaches, and it was this like illustrious thing to one day have a coach. So I went to hire my first coach, and I thought, maybe I'll find my Wendy. Maybe I'll find a Wendy plus someone who's actually been an operator in my role, who's seen it, been there all before, and can kind of guide me and let me know what's happened and help me along the way. But I didn't find that. Few coaches, if any, had operating experience, and no one had worked at a startup. But I did find a great coach. However, because they didn't have this experience, there were limits around what we could cover and what I could ask for. That coach couldn't act as like an advisor or board member or really a deep thought partner around the operational things that I was doing in my role. He had never been in my role. He had never done anything close to it. And so I realized that there was value in coaching, but that I still wanted something different. So when I left Scribd, I went into this amazing program called Leaders in Tech. And it's based off of Stanford's famous touchy-feely course. It's really all about understanding how humans interact with our emotions. And I got to say, I was completely hooked. I love this. I love psychology. If I was going back to school, I would study psychology. And so I started to think maybe there's this new approach to coaching that could be focused on business partners and partnering with founders to help achieve the outcomes that they want, right? That isn't just on making them feel better or working through what's right there on the table, but understanding this partnership with a founder and helping them achieve what they're trying to do at the company. So as a coach, that's what I focus on. Instead of the standard hour every week or two, I have both regular meetings with my clients, but we also work on one-off projects and I'm on call for them when they need it. It's definitely a more in-depth approach to coaching and far more tactical and in the weeds than anything I've seen in market, but that's what I'm most interested in. So I focus on where I think I can help them most. That is, as I talked about earlier, sort of companies that have hit that product market fit and are trying to scale it. They're trying to get their culture, their products, their team to grow. So that typically means kind of a post-Series A, getting some real revenue in the door, having a team of 50 to 100 people. And if you're a founder and all that sounds good, amazing, definitely check out my website, firstcall.co, and reach out. Would love to talk to you and potentially work together.
Amazing. Well, look, congratulations on launching First Call. I'm so thrilled for you and all the people that you're going to get to work with. And of course, identify a gap in the market, see a space for there to be someone to fill it, and going to fill it is exactly what I would expect of you in starting a coaching practice. So congratulations again. Two last questions. One, I will ask because someone said you have to ask Jared this. So what is the difference between good transparency and bad transparency?
So I cannot take credit for this. I love this, and I know, or I think I know why somebody would ask you to ask me that. I quote Mathilde Collin from Front. I think she has the most amazing tweet on this, which is that good transparency answers questions, creates trust, and reassures people. And bad transparency raises more questions than it answers. And this comes up a lot. You're in a company and people say, well, I want to know why we didn't sign that deal. I want to know how much my coworkers are getting paid. I want to know what our exact X, Y, and Z is. I want to know what happened in our board meeting in every aspect. Why is there a closed session? And the reality is that some of this information is helpful. It really answers questions. It creates trust. It reassures people. It helps explain what's going on in the company. And some of it is bad. It just creates more questions and more confusion because not everybody in the company has the context that the CEO has in order to interpret that. And I think that most companies that have been successful it can feel like you have a target on your back as you're going through your process of growing and scaling and becoming the company that they are today. They had grenades and bombs and rifles and all of this coming at them from all sides. And if that had just been totally transparent to everyone and known, for many people, they would have given up. They would have left the company. They would have thrown in the towel. There's a reason why most people are not CEOs of companies and why most people wouldn't make good CEOs of companies. They are going into the wilderness and weathering the storm in sort of an insane way, right? And they're going against the odds. So having some of that information not be transparent and having there be a little bit of air cover so that people can be focused and get their work done, and having the people that have the context and say, hey, I can see light at the end of this tunnel, but it's a tricky tunnel that we're going to have to go through. I think that's okay. And I think you have to be thoughtful about what you share and what you don't to make sure you're not just providing information, but you're providing context so the people at your organization knows what's going on and that it informs how they do their work.
Couldn't agree more. Last question. What is one lesson you learned later in life, but would have been helpful earlier on?
So my favorite one of these is that success and happiness are different things. Now, that might sound kind of trivial. I'm actually reading a book by Arthur Brooks, who's arguably the best expert on the science of happiness. And he says that happiness is made of three things: enjoyment, satisfaction, and purpose. Now, enjoyment often gets mistaken for pleasure, but pleasure is more like hedonism. Drugs, sex, and rock and roll, all those things might give you pleasure, but they don't actually necessarily lead to enjoyment. So enjoyment is pleasure plus community and consciousness. This means that you're doing something you enjoy with other people and you're being thoughtful about it. So as an example, if you go binge drinking with a bunch of friends, you've got pleasure and you've got community, but there's not a lot of consciousness about it. Conversely, you take the same group of people, you have a salon style dinner about some topic in the world that's interesting, Now you have all three, right? It's something that you enjoy with people that you enjoy doing it with, and there's some thoughtfulness around it. So that's how you get to enjoyment. Satisfaction is something that generally comes when you accomplish something that's challenging. So there's another book called Flow, and they talk about it as if you play a game of tennis. Actually, one of our former coworkers, Josh Hanna, recommended this book to me. It's like if you play a game of tennis with someone that's significantly worse than you and you win, there's not a lot of satisfaction in it. You knew you were going to win. It was easy, right? So we want to be challenged. We want there to be some risk that we aren't going to win. We don't want it to be easy. So that's when we're in this state of flow. That's when we're getting satisfaction. And lastly is purpose. We want to feel that what we're doing has some meaning and that we're connected to it. It's something that we believe in. And this is why so many startups have these mission statements and vision statements. They allow us to see if we connect with that purpose, and they do such a better job of it than big companies where you feel disconnected from that meaning. And so startups have a unique ability to give us happiness or to contribute to our happiness. But there's a really thin line between that and just working really hard. So for years, I was so busy with work that I wouldn't take the time to think about these things. I just kept pushing forward. I'd work till 3 or 4 in the morning. I get 4 or 5 hours of sleep. I'd forget to eat during the day. And then the things outside of work in my life, all of them just got whatever was left. I didn't really put specific energy into them. I definitely subscribed to the work hard, play hard culture. And I was living on this constant adrenaline drip versus really living in the satisfaction of my life. So I think sometimes coaches can sound like they've got it all figured out and, like, oh yeah, so now I don't do any of those things. I do all of those things or most of them, right? I still stay up till 2 in the morning, often working. I don't always get as much sleep as I should need. I ate lunch today at 4 p.m. because I forgot and was heads down on work. But I hope that I'm at least becoming a little bit more conscious, a little bit more aware, and slowly starting to shift those habits towards something that balances success and happiness. And so for me, it's the awareness of this and working towards it. Like I'm on a forever journey. I think most of us are. And hopefully that means that I'm in it with my clients, versus pretending like I'm at the top of the mountain and they're just on the way up.
Amazing. Well, thank you for that answer, and thank you for a tremendous conversation. It's so good to see you, my friend, and I'm so thrilled for you and all that you're building and excited to see your growth from here. For all of you listeners, check out the show notes to be able to find Jared online. Everything will be linked, and definitely subscribe to Brick by Brick for more of similar conversations going forward. Thanks, Jared.
Thank you.